History as it happens, March 9th, 2021. The future of the GOP.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
We seek an open world, a world in which no people, great or small, will live in angry isolation.
Progress may be slow, measured in inches and feet, not miles, but we will progress.
I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
From Eisenhower to Nixon, from Reagan to Bush 41, Gingrich and the Republican Revolution, from Bush 43 to Trump. The GOP and the conservative movement scored unlikely victories and suffered humiliating defeats. And now, as the nation recovers from the scars of a pandemic and political violence, the grand old party of Lincoln is at a crossroads. As we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
We are taking the first steps, and we're taking them in a contract with the American people.
For me to stay in the House would make it impossible for a new leader to have a chance to grow, to learn.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. We've begun the search for hidden chemical and biological weapons and already know of hundreds of sites.
For the next 4 years, the brave Republicans in this room will be at the heart of the effort to oppose the radical Democrats, the fake news media, and their toxic cancel culture. Something new to our ears.
Hey everybody, that was quite an audio trip, wasn't it? You know, political parties are not permanent. We forget this because our two major parties today have been around for so long. But remember, way back when, we used to have Whigs and Federalists. And the Democratic and Republican parties of today are quite different than the Democratic and Republican parties of, say, the 1960s or 1970s or even the 1980s. Remember Nelson Rockefeller, the liberal governor of New York? He was a Republican. Are there any liberals left in the Republican Party today? A big tent, no more. And in today's episode, we're going to talk to a great historian, Sean Wilentz, about where the Republican Party might go from here being the aftermath of Donald Trump's election defeat.
It's unclear, though, to me, where this is all going. In other words, in the short run, yes, Donald Trump, I think, is very much a factor in the Republican Party, to say the least. He's a kind of president in exile because they've declared Biden illegitimate. So, you know, he's still very much a force, but he's not going to last forever.
To talk about a post-Trump GOP ignores the reality that Trump isn't gone. At CPAC, he didn't commit to running again in 2024, but Washington Times political reporter S.A. Miller was at the conference, and he tells us from the CPAC vantage point, it's still Trump's party.
Well beyond his appearance there, much of the conservative movement there, as reflected in CPAC, is Trumpism, his agenda and the things that he did to the party to change it. And people down there were saying, you know, it's not CPAC anymore, it's TPAC. These were Trump activists. The conservative movement is now a Trump movement.
But there is a rift.
The rift is between the establishment and between the voters, which really puts the power behind Trump and not behind, you know, the establishment, which those people see as part of the problem.
The establishment versus the people, because it is the people, not party leaders, who choose candidates for office in primary elections now. And that is how someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a QAnon believer, made it to where she is now.
I want to tell you, Republican voters support him still. The party is his. It doesn't belong to anybody else.
So, the rift between pro and anti-Trump factions. It's out in the open now. The election's over. Trump lost by 7 million popular votes. And as Mitch McConnell put it on the floor of the U.S. Senate, the January 6th mob attack on the Capitol was Trump's responsibility.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it.
Still, only a handful of Republicans voted for impeachment or conviction, and McConnell wasn't even one of them. In the House, Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger was one of 10 Republicans to vote for impeachment. Now even members of his own family are shunning him for betraying the Trumpian cause. For his part, Kinzinger produced a video in which he begged his fellow Republicans to finalize their divorce from Trumpism.
Hope has given way to fear. Outrage has replaced opportunity. And worst of all, our deep convictions are ignored. They've been replaced by poisonous conspiracies and lies. This is not the Republican road, and now we know exactly where this new and dangerous road leads.
If Ronald Reagan's presidency a generation ago was the most consequential of the second half of the 20th century, it's still too early to know how long a shadow Trump's single-term and chaotic style of governing will cast over the coming decade. But if I were to pick one person with whom to discuss these matters, it would be my next guest, Princeton historian Sean Wilentz. He's one of the preeminent scholars in our country, the author of several excellent books on U.S. history, including The Rise of American Democracy, which won the prestigious Bancroft Prize, and The Age of Reagan, A History, 1974 to 2008. Sean Wilentz, welcome to the podcast. We're honored to have you.
It's a delight to be here, Mark.
So before we dive in, I'd like to say that your book, The Age of Reagan, served as an inspiration for this podcast to analyze present-day events historically, as you wrote. You say we have to do it because we just can't wait decades when the recent past is so important to our own times. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with any discussion about American politics or present-day news is that people don't think historically. You know, people don't understand that what happened now has a history. It came out of someplace, came out of something. What I wanted, above all, to try to do was to impart or try to help people impart historical consciousness to recent and current events. It's something that can't be encouraged too much. That's what I was trying to do in The Age of Reagan, in fact. I mean, I was trying to write a book of recent history, but again, the underlying idea was to say, look, if you're looking at the newspaper even today, you're talking about the Senate's voting on the COVID bill. Well, what does that mean historically? How do we put that in the context of American politics going back 5, 10, even 50 years? It's important to be able to understand things in the present in that way. The question of having a decent interval pass before you write history, whether you have to wait 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I get what that's about, is that you have to have some sort of distance and you have to have more material. You have to have more, sources and stuff. That's all true, but I never had any pretension that this is going to be the last word on the Reagan presidency and its aftermath. What I was hoping to do was something between journalism, the first draft of history, and what the third, fourth, fifth drafts might look like. I wanted to do a first historical take on what had happened.
So you concluded the Age of Reagan is over. When did it end, and what happened? How did it come to an end?
I think it ended in 2008. I still stick to that idea that the Obama election did that. It's not to say that the forces that were unleashed by Reagan's presidency, and the Republican Party in particular, came to a halt. But I do think that from the mid-90s onward, there was a radicalization of the party. The party was no longer even what it had been under Reagan by the time we get to 2000, 2001, by the time we get to the W administration, the W. Bush administration. But I do think that there was a break, and the Obama election really was the break. It wasn't the break in quite the way I thought it was going to be when I finished writing the book, which was right around that time. But it was a break nevertheless. What we see, there are continuities certainly between what had happened under Reagan and what was to come under Trump. But I think that the Trump politics, the politics that developed after Obama's election, there are continuities, but there are also real differences between that and everything that came before. The Tea Party and everything that led up to January 6th, that's a different kind of politics than the Reagan era.
So in what ways did Donald Trump build on the grievance or resentment politics of Nixon and Reagan? And in what ways is Donald Trump a departure from them?
Yes and yes. There is a continuous history, I think, going back to Nixon and the Southern strategy of playing on resentments, particularly of white working class Americans and then Southern evangelical Christians or white Southerners generally. That was part and parcel of Republican Party politics from at least 1968 on. And you can see a continuity there. The Reagan campaign in 1980 kind of expanded upon that, reaching out to the moral majority, which had been founded in the late 70s precisely to politicize that segment of the population. And out of all of that, one found the beginnings of the making of what we now think of as the Trump base, which is a combination of white Southerners. The white South is actually at the heart of all of this, but not just the white South, Northerners as well, so-called Reagan Democrats, we saw the creation of that base, and that base is, very much in the news, very central to the politics of Donald Trump. There's also a continuity in certain basic Republican politics. I mean, through this process of radicalization that I was talking about, there are a couple of things that actually stand out as being completely continuous in what the Republicans have been up to. In terms of policy, that's been basically about massive regressive tax cuts. You go back to Reagan in the 80s, but then, right through the W in his administration, and then Trump, kind of, what should we say, turbocharged kind of Reaganism on the matter of taxes. That's one thing. The other is judicial appointments. Mitch McConnell was very happy to have Trump support. He and Mitch McConnell were on the same page about that. So appoint as many pretty right-wing judges to the federal judiciary to end regulations, to do all the kinds of things that can be done permanently to undo any kind of liberal program. That happened under Trump, and that was classic Republican. These are the classic things that Republicans had stood for. In other ways, Trump's was a great departure. Can you imagine, for example, the scene in Helsinki where Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, Trump was saying, well, you're right, Mr. Putin, and my own intelligence services are wrong about what you allegedly did. Can you imagine Ronald Reagan, spinning in his grave about all of that? I mean, if you read in the Age of Reagan, Martin, I mean, one of the things I rather admired about President Reagan was the way that he handled Gorbachev and the way that Gorbachev handled him in the beginning of the end of the Cold War. But he understood that the United States and the Soviet Union were fundamentally antagonistic. This didn't seem to be the case for Donald Trump and the Russian Federation.
Reagan had a sunny optimism and a very important pragmatic side that seems to be missing from politics now.
Yeah. Well, certainly. I mean, to understand Ronald Reagan, I think you really have to understand Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They seem to be as night and day. In many ways, the Reagan presidency was the anti-New Deal. However, Ronald Reagan came to politics as a liberal Democrat, very much admired FDR. I gather used to do impressions of FDR, which people liked to do in those days. He imbibed the same kind of optimistic, expansive consciousness or expansive style that FDR did. Whereas American conservatism had been, allied with people as, what should we say, as unsunny as Robert Taft or Joe McCarthy or Barry Goldwater, for that matter. Ronald Reagan was different. Ronald Reagan brought the personality, the personalism, the warmth, the charisma, not of simply of a movie star, but of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to American conservatism. To me, that was his great political gift. So that when one thinks of Ronald Reagan, one thinks of America on the march, America, overcoming its difficulties, America coming out of the dolors of the 1970s, late 1970s, after Watergate, and then everything that happened later on.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history.
This is Ronald Reagan's projecting, that our best days are ahead of us, that we're going to be great. This is a style which certainly has disappeared from Republican Party politics. Between the Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump aren't exactly Ronald Reagan. But then he also talked about the pragmatic side. And that's true, too. I mean, Reagan came to politics out of the union movement, in which he was a negotiator. He had to work for the Screen Actors Guild. He was most famous in that regard for exposing the communists in Hollywood. That's part of what he did. But really, he was a union guy. He was used to negotiating. He understood that, that's how you get things done. And he was that way as the governor of California. Some of the things that you see him saying, for example, on questions of reproductive rights, I believe, in a lot of different ways, Ronald Reagan was more than willing to cut a deal if he thought that he could get his basic program advanced. This is very much outside the realm of a Republican Party politics, certainly since Reagan, really changing, under Newt Gingrich and his scorched earth kind of politics. So it's all very, very different.
Reagan did sign a liberal abortion rights bill when he was the governor of California.
That's right.
He was not hostile to immigration either. Yet in his 1981 inaugural address, he famously said, "The government is not the solution to the problem, it is the problem." And it's not a long leap to go from where Reagan was in 1981 to a real anti-government ideology that we see in some precincts today. Why don't you pick it up from there?
Well, I think, yes, you're right. There is the famous line in the 1981 inaugural address, although even there, go back and read it. When he says the government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem, he prefaces it saying, in the current crisis, right? What he means is, the stagflation, the economic difficulties that people were facing then. In fact, government proved to be the solution to that problem, because when he kept Paul Volcker as the head of the Fed, it was the Fed that did the most to get rid of the inflation that was going to lead to the so-called Reagan boom. It's not that he was dissembling or lying, it's just that it didn't exactly turn out the way he said. But my point is only that he was actually very careful to say in the current situation, that is the case. It's not necessarily always the case. Now, look, Reagan was a very, very conservative, right-wing Republican at the time. So he did believe all of that. He did believe the government was a bit of a problem. But even then, I think that what we're seeing today is at a whole different level, what Reagan was talking about. The attempt under the last administration to turn, for example, the Justice Department into a private law firm for the president. This is nothing that Ronald Reagan would have done. He might have called upon people to help him out, as during Iran-Contra, but it was a whole different thing. He wouldn't have attacked the core of the executive branch in a way that the last administration did. He was not entertaining militias, for example. Talk about extreme anti-government views. You're going to egg on supporters, for example, in Michigan, to take over the state house, including people who are planning to kidnap the governor and execute her. This is not Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, Liberate Michigan was Donald Trump's tweet. You mentioned the rest of Reagan's address. I actually did read it in preparation for a recent podcast where later, after his famous line about the government being the problem, he does say, I don't want to eliminate the government. We need it. We just need to get it off our backs. Turning back to the present, how do you define Trumpism? Is it programmatic? For instance, immigration restrictions and voting restrictions seem to be policy priorities. Or is Trumpism a narrative or an attitude about the world?
It's a good question. We're finding that out. Certainly Trumpism is about Donald Trump, first and foremost. It is a cult of personality. There is no Trumpism without Donald Trump. I don't even think he could pass it on to his own children if they wanted to. If he were to leave politics now, could Donald Trump Jr. be a Trumpist? It would be near beer in comparison to his father. So I think that first and foremost, Trumpism is about Donald Trump in his personality and in everything that he does. But is there something larger? Yes, in that, as you talk about immigration, Martin, yes, Ronald Reagan believed in immigration reform. He thought it was a good idea. Everything that Ronald Reagan stood for regarding immigration, Donald Trump is against. In that sense, Trump really did a complete about-face on what had been, Republican principles. Same thing with foreign policy. To the extent that the Republicans, this is growing out of the consensus coming out of World War II, that the Republicans had a stance of America being important in world affairs, having a role to play in world affairs. This is something that Trump turned around and took in a very different direction. So there is something different about this force. It's unclear, though, to me, where this is all going. In other words, in the short run, yes, Donald Trump, I think, is very much a factor in the Republican Party, to say the least. He's a kind of president in exile because they've declared Biden illegitimate. So, he's still very much a force, but he's not going to last forever. And the question is only what happens to the Republican Party thereafter. That, I think, is really unclear. We're going to see the battle royal inside the Republican Party. Who's going to win? I wouldn't want to bet against Donald Trump winning, frankly. But it's not going to last forever. So what are we seeing the emergence of? I think it's entirely possible we're going to see the emergence under someone who inherits the mantle, whoever it's going to be, whether it's Senator Cruz, perhaps, or Senator Hawley, perhaps, Senator Cotton, perhaps, who knows? We're going to see a party that's even considerably to the right of where we are in the Republican Party now. That has been the trend, The story of the Republican Party, as I was hinting at earlier, really, since Gingrich at any rate, has been very much the party that brought in this base, that stoked this base, that created this base, that always promised this base it was going to deliver on things like getting rid of Roe v. Wade, or you name the things, all the possibilities, never quite delivering on any of that. Doing very little actually to uplift, say, the incomes of average American workers. No, that wasn't what they were about, but they were still stoking those resentments. They thought that they could ride the back of that tiger that they had created to victory again and again and again. That every 4 years, they would stoke that base, whether it's with, Willie Horton or whatever, and be able to ride to victory. What Trump showed was that, in fact, the base could devour you. And that's what happened. They thought they would ride the back of the tiger, and they ended up inside. Now, the question is, to me, is only whether that dynamic will continue, and that someone who picks up Trumpism is going to take it in yet another quote unquote populist direction. But that's not a forecast. I'm a historian. I'm not a prognosticator.
As you say, we predict the future at our peril. Well, as a practical matter, when it comes to winning a presidential election, because the Republican Party is actually still doing okay in the House and Senate, it doesn't seem to make much sense to continue to back Trump or a candidate like him, considering the results. He lost to Hillary Clinton in 2016 by 3 million votes and eked it out in the Electoral College. The margin to Biden was much larger. And I do sense that many Trump supporters who may have been on the fence just got tired of all of it. And it seems like a long shot, never say never, of him making a comeback in 2024. But, you did raise the issue of whether he'll have inheritors and whether the establishment in the party, which now wants to disown him, can actually manage to do that.
Yeah. There's a bunch of questions in all of that.
Yeah, that's my interviewing style. Just, lob 18 questions.
It's great. No, I like it. You have to listen close, but you get it all. It's good. First of all, the question of the establishment. I don't know that there's much of an establishment left, frankly. You could see with Mitch McConnell, for example. Mitch McConnell having to keep his donors happy by denouncing Trump. This is after the impeachment vote, but voting for acquittal. He wasn't going to be able to have any kind of say inside the Republican Party, really, and vote for conviction, even though I think he knows that Trump was guilty of sin. Now, my guess is that Mitch McConnell is on the way out, not from his position as minority leader, but he's going to retire. I think he's going to retire. And he's trying to fix the Kentucky legislature in such a way as to make sure that the governor, who's a Democrat, doesn't get to name his successor. My guess is that's it. He's not going to be around that much longer. So what is the Republican establishment without Mitch McConnell? Mitt Romney? Mitt Romney is pretty isolated, I'd say.
He's in his 70s, too.
And he's no spring chicken. So I don't see the establishment exists anymore. I think that party is gone, the party of the Bushes, say. And it's unclear what's going to take its place, but not an establishment like that. Then comes to the question of Trump and Trump himself. And look, you still have to go through those primaries if you're going to get the nomination. If you had, let's start the primaries today, tomorrow, and you had, Hawley and Cruz and Cotton and Trump running for the Republican nomination, I'd say Trump would be in pretty good shape. Why? Because each one of those guys is trying to grab the Trump base. And, Trump owns the Trump base. You're not going to take it away from him. This is in the short term. Things can change enormously. So again, we're not going to predict. But I wouldn't count Trump out by any means, even though, here's another point. The Republican Party has not done terribly well in presidential elections, since 1992. How many times have they won a majority? So the Republican Party has a problem. The question the Republican Party faces is not that of losing so much as is how you game the votes. And that's a matter of the Electoral College and gerrymandering, and then finally voter suppression. That seems to be the wave of the future for the Republican Party staying in power. But, as you say, they're doing pretty well.
The Democratic Party has plenty of problems, too, and I intend to do a podcast about the Democrats.
You know it.
But we'll stick to the Republicans today. What about the conservative movement? Some point out that Donald Trump is not really all that conservative. He opposes free trade. He opposed Reagan-era type of muscular foreign policy, allegiances, NATO, that he's more of a populist.
Yeah, or something. Populist is a tricky term to use, but whatever it is, he's basically a right-wing demagogue. And yes, but look at how quickly so many Republicans, at any rate, who had aligned themselves with the conservative movement, bought into Trump, hook, line, and sinker. Think of the senators we were just talking about. So where is the conservative movement? What is the conservative movement in this moment? People that I know, for example, who are conservatives, who are rock-ribbed conservatives in the 10, 15 years ago, many of them are now never Trumpers, but they're out of the party. They have no place to go. At this point, for example, my friend Bill Kristol is spending a lot of his time saying that Republicans and Democrats have to unite in order to save American democracy. That's where the conservative movement, or people who are aligned with the conservative movement, at least some of them now are. And add to the fact is that what are the great new exciting conservative ideas? If the conservative movement meant anything, it was generating ideas, whether it was Heritage Foundation, AEI, Republican Industrial Complex of institutes and so forth, think tanks. What's the new Republican idea? Gerrymandering? Keeping immigrants out? There's no there there.
If the age of Reagan is over, maybe the age of William F. Buckley is over too. You mentioned ideas. One observation I've read recently, it was actually an article about Rush Limbaugh after he passed away. It made the point that the modern conservative movement no longer has, and the Republican Party by extension, doesn't have a positive agenda any longer.
I agree. There was quite a clear agenda, which was to undo as much of the New Deal as you could, and the tax cuts certainly did that. They were very successful in what they did, but they hit a limit. There was only so far as the American electorate was really going to allow them to go. Then it became all about power. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about doing anything. It was just staying in power, almost for the sake of staying in power. That's what they're doing now. It's no longer a normal political party in the sense that we understand what political parties are. It's much more akin to a kind of electoral Bolshevism, if you see what I'm saying. The ends justify the means, and we're going to do anything we can to stay in power.
A few years ago, you wrote an article, it was for The New Yorker, possibly, about Glenn Beck and how he was kind of recycling 1950s era anti-communist conspiracy theories. And I think you alluded to in that article how Buckley was able to keep the John Birch Society on the margins.
Mm-hmm.
And now somebody who adheres to QAnon is in Congress. What's your take on this development? Is this going to be a one-off, or do you feel like we might see 10 or 15 QAnon Congress members?
QAnon is always there in one way or another. I mean, it goes back in American history, this kind of crazy conspiratorial wacko stuff. It was even there in the 50s. I mean, it was way at the margins, but it's always with us. So this is nothing new. What's new is that you have a member of Congress that's spouting this stuff. It's interesting, the history of these movements, and as I say, there's a lot of them. I mean, when Thomas Jefferson was running for president in 1800, people were accusing him of being an agent of the Bavarian Illuminati, and they were going to set up guillotines at every crossroads in every town in America. This was pretty nutty, and people, sober Federalists actually believed this. So, this is not the first time that we've seen this in American history. Classically, what happens, and you may be seeing it now, is that this kind of thinking eventually turns on itself, that the factionalization occurs, people start blaming each other. For example, when in the QAnon conspiracy, right? What's today? Today's March 5th? March 4th passed. That was the day that everything was supposed to be delivered because it didn't get delivered on January 20th. They make the mistake of actually predicting some sort of wonderful apocalyptic ending. Well, when it doesn't happen, people start pointing fingers at each other, and these movements tend to disintegrate. Those kinds of movements. And I suspect that's going to happen with at least some of them now. They don't scare me as much. The militias scare me more. That's a real threat to public safety. QAnon's maybe a threat to public mental health, but not quite in the same way that the Michigan Wolverines do.
Let's talk about the influence of the Christian right, Christian evangelicals on the Republican Party. Reagan had an uneasy relationship with them?
He had an instrumental connection to the Christian right. He used them, and he used them very effectively, and they all flocked to him. But he never even showed up. I mean, remember, they have these annual, I guess they still do, these annual rallies on Roe v. Wade Day, and Reagan would even show up. He'd always show up by telephone. He'd pay lip service to that stuff, but he was never really into it. He wasn't a believing Christian in any profound way, but he was happy to take their votes. As he said, you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. But by endorsing them, it meant that he was going to help them out with judges. The whole idea of taking over the federal judiciary, that's where the Christian right actually did have an impact, beginning with Ed Meese and the Federalist Society in the 80s. So to that extent, the Reagan administration, at any rate, did something on their behalf. But in terms of style, in terms of remember, Ronald Reagan, he had two things that were animating him above all. One was to reduce the size of the federal government, right? And to undo some of the New Deal. And the other was to beat Soviet communism and to win the Cold War. Without the Cold War, in effect, really, it's impossible to imagine Reaganism, you see what I'm saying. The age of Reagan in some ways disappeared when the Soviet Union finally cracked up. At that point, a key pillar of Reaganism disappeared, which makes it all the more ironic. A Republican Party that still claims its allegiance to Ronald Reagan would defend, would stave off the influence of Putin in American politics, for example, or just say that it's all a myth and it's all a hoax. and to stand by while their president, sidled up to the likes of Vladimir Putin. This is something that is anathema to Reaganism, but that's how things have changed.
Princeton, Sean Wilentz, this was an honor. Thank you for your insights on the Republican Party, and maybe we'll have you back soon to talk about the Democrats. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
The United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The U.S. invaded Afghanistan 20 years ago to avenge 9/11, and now the Biden administration faces a deadline to withdraw the last American troops from the battlefield, ending the forever war. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.